This is my voice.
You keep it with you at all times, don't you?
I do, unless I go to a rock concert or something, and I leave it there.
Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. This episode is sponsored by Component One, makers of Widgmo. If you need stunning UI elements or awesome graphs and charts, then go to widgmo.com and check them out.
Don't panic, there'll be pay for most of us.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 62 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Jameson Dance.
Hi guys.
Joe Eames.
Hey there.
AJ O'Neill.
Not coming at you live. Not at all.
I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv, and we have a special guest this week, and that's Dylan Schiemann. So, do you want to introduce yourself real quick, Dylan?
Sure, thanks Charles. I'm Dylan. I'm one of the founders of an open source project called the Dojo Toolkit, and I'm also the CEO at SitePen, a company that builds web apps and provides JavaScript training and support.
Awesome. So, Dojo's been around for a long time, hasn't it?
9 years.
9 years.
Oh yeah, 3 lifetimes in the internet age, I guess.
Does that make it older than jQuery, or?
It does, yes. jQuery, I think, started about 7 years ago, maybe? 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, I remember seeing a couple of websites built in Dojo way back in the day. I don't remember exactly which ones they were, but for some reason I got the impression that it was a framework, but it's more of a toolkit. It's much more like jQuery than it is like, say, Backbone or Ember or any of those.
Well, it's kind of everything, right? So you can use it as a simple toolkit like jQuery. You have DOM manipulation APIs and, AJAX event handlers and promises and deferreds and, other functional programming constructs. And then there's a widget library on top of it that is very nice, and it's internationalizable and accessible. And each widget, in many ways, can be bound to a data object store, giving it sort of a little MVC style interface. And then, but there are application frameworks that build on top of that, and native vector graphics APIs, and so it's really kind of this massive collection of 1,500 or 1,600 modules that come together and, start as a very small toolkit that can be, 3 or 4 kilobytes gzipped, all the way up to, the entire kitchen sink if you wanted it.
So just to give us an idea, are there websites out there that are built on Dojo that you're sort of proud of?
Yeah, I mean, it's always frustrating to be, because of course you see your work used in ways maybe you wouldn't want to use it. But, there are some popular consumer sites that use Dojo, such as like Ameritrade.com uses it for their stock brokerage platform, or the Wall Street Journal uses it, as their toolkit of choice for viewing financial news. A lot of banks have started to embrace Dojo, like JPMorgan Chase or TD Bank up in Canada, things like that. Of course, SitePen and Dojo use their own toolkit. There's a project called Voro.com that uses Dojo in a pretty interesting way that is financial charting in the cloud. And, there are thousands of other sites, but a large majority of Dojo use lives inside applications that are more complex than a typical .com. They're more along the lines of, I need to build a financial trading system and I want to do that in a browser, but, it's behind a firewall or behind a login. Or, one of the more popular companies for building mapping technology is a company called Esri. And they provide, something competitive with Google Maps, but much more focused on people who typically work in governments or, agencies that need to provide demographic information. And so they built their JavaScript API on top of Dojo. So almost any government agency that has a map-based project uses Dojo because they choose to use that API. So there's a lot of reach into a lot of different places that isn't obvious at times.
So I feel like there's an elephant in the room right now, and I want to make that elephant visible to everyone. And that's that Dojo seems like it has this kind of connotation of old and uncool. Why should I care about it now?
Well, if you tried it 9 years ago, it's basically not at all like it is today. And, what we're seeing is that the JavaScript community has kind of grown up a lot, right? So 6 or 7 years ago, people were like, look, yellow fade effect, or look, I can do an AJAX request. But now what we're seeing is pretty much everyone out there is like, okay, we need modules, we need good application architecture, we need all of these different things. And many of these things have sort of permeated from Dojo into other projects. In fact, I think Peter Higgins, either yesterday or today, gave a talk at JSConf called Dojo Already Did That, which is kind of a joke about JSConf every year. Like, people are like, oh, Dojo already did that. And, we are a community that seems to love to reinvent the wheel. Even if there's something out there that's great, we want to sort of recreate it ourselves from scratch. And that's cool, but what it means is that a lot of the things that we've done with Dojo, you can easily use in other projects. So it's not really about, hey, use Dojo or jQuery or Backbone or whatever, right? It's more about, these are tools you can mix and match modules as needed, or you can, decide, hey, I like this approach and I want to use it. So for example, the most popular module loading system today on the web is RequireJS. Well, RequireJS is a Dojo Foundation project that was started by the person who worked on the Dojo module loader. So, we've really tried to take the approach of, if you don't want to use Dojo, that's fine. We would like to give you the tools that, you could use inside other ecosystems, rather than sort of trying to lock you into a particular environment. So the best thing I've seen Dojo do for the community is sort of create these things that other people are using without really knowing they're using anything at all related to Dojo, which is fine. So if they have that connotation, they can ignore that, but chances are they're probably using something that comes from Dojo, and that's what it's all about, really, is making it easier to build applications and providing good projects.
Sure, that makes sense.
It was interesting. I was looking through the tutorials to get started, and the first couple that I went through, I was like, well, I do most of this with jQuery, but there's still so much more there, and there were a couple of things that really stuck out to me as things that get me a little bit excited about Dojo. The first one is that it, like you said, it hooks into AMD and uses RequireJS for everything, which at first I didn't get it, but once I started using it, it was like, oh, this makes things really, really nice. Is there a reason why you decided to go with AMD and RequireJS?
Well, prior to that, we had a synchronous loading module system, which was, the syntax of it was a little less cryptic, but the problem, of course, is that you were loading modules synchronously, which gave the impression of every application being slow. And the way we solved that early on was saying, well, just do a build, and a build is basically take all these HTTP resources and combine them into one or two files so that they can be optimized quickly. But of course, no one does that when they're first trying out a project. So the impression was, hey, this Dojo thing is slow. Also, we had this concept of namespaces so that, you could easily mix and match work across projects. But namespaces involve the creation of fairly large object structures in memory, and especially in older versions of IE, this made applications quickly sort of cycle into that constant garbage collection mode that we all love when dealing with IE 6 or 7. And so AMD sort of evolved from that as a new approach that would give us two benefits. One is being able to do all of our JavaScript loading asynchronously by doing script tag injection rather than by doing XHRs to pull in resources. And then the second benefit was that we could do all of our modules somewhat anonymously, so that basically every reference to a module is just a local variable lookup. So you don't have these long, namespace chains, but also you don't have these large object structures in memory representing, what you're just trying to do to keep things separated and modular. So for us, it was sort of a syntax that we could retrofit into the language that covered all of our use cases for how we need to load modules. And it gave us, these nice performance benefits without any other change. So for us, it was sort of a no-brainer. And, it evolved somewhat also out of the CommonJS module specification that's popular for Node. And, the CommonJS syntax is a bit simpler, but when you're running an application inside of Node, you don't worry about loading resources asynchronously because they're all already there in memory or, on the same server. But when you're running over, the web, you want to be able to load things asynchronously, and that syntax, unfortunately, doesn't facilitate that. And hence, the AMD syntax and the approach makes that easy for us to to, get the best of both worlds, which is, something that can work over the web and that's, fairly terse and concise and modular.
I think you've outlined the benefits of AMD and RequireJS very, very well there.
Thanks.
Those are the problems that it solved for me.
Absolutely. And, if you don't have a large project and you don't have a lot of modules, I still think it's a good idea because at the end of the day, your application is going to get bigger. It's going to be used by other people. And, it just introduces a level of discipline that you don't get if you try and sort of shove all of your application logic into a single file.
So I have another question or another thing that I wanted to go into, and that is I was just kind of muddling around your website, and I noticed that you have a widgets framework.
Yes.
Can you talk about that really quickly? Because I really haven't seen anything like that. I've done similar things with views in Backbone and stuff, but it's not the same, and it'd kind of be nice to have something that really is kind of focused on widgets.
Right. So what Dijit is it's a collection of user interface widgets as well as a framework for building user interface widgets. And so basically you can think of the widgets that are provided in Dijit as sort of reference implementation widgets. So they are generally classified into a few different categories. One is form controls, basically providing replacements for most of the native controls where you can't style them in old IE the way you would want to. As well as controls that don't exist. Even in HTML5, sometimes you want a combo box, and that hasn't been around for a long time until now. The second class is layout widgets, and the idea is basically if you want to create a single page application and you want to put things side by side and you want to introduce splitters and other user interface controls to basically be able to say, oh, I want this to be next to this and I want this to lay out here. I want this to be closable, things like that. And then the third is sort of other widgets like grids and rich text editor controls and trees and things like that sort of don't fall into other those two other categories. But then more importantly, underneath that is a system that supports several things. One is any widget can be instantiated either through an HTML markup with custom attributes using the HTML5 data attributes, or it can be instantiated through JavaScript. Two, they're all internationalizable and accessible. So basically, it's really easy using resource bundles to provide translations for each of your widgets, as well as using ARIA roles and all of the good web content accessibility guidelines work to basically say, okay, this widget works in a color blindness environment. It works through keyboard navigation. It works with screen readers, things like that. The next thing is that basically each widget is an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. And so the HTML is basically the underlying template that's going to be rendered. And it has some nice convenient custom attributes that can provide hooks to your JavaScript. So for example, when you want to put 5 widgets in a page, you don't want to use any HTML IDs in them because, of course, you can only have one in a page. So it defines sort of these custom attach points that basically say, okay, in my markup, I've defined this attach point foo node. Then inside the scope of the instance of that widget, I can say this.foo node, and it gives me a reference to that node reference within that widget instance. So that's really quite handy and quite easy for, creating reusable multi-use widgets within a page. Beyond that, it supports a lot of other features. For example, you can mix in the capability for a widget to contain other widgets or for managing relationships between widgets. Most of the widgets use a pub sub mechanism to be able to communicate changes. And then widgets that display data bind to our object store API, which basically allows us to provide different data services, but the widget itself is just aware of the ability to get and set data. So for example, you can say, I've got a grid widget, it's bound to this data source that's in memory, and I want to get data updates, and then basically hook it up, and then you get a grid that live updates as your data source changes. So it's a pretty nice system for user interface controls, whereas a lot of the backbone views are sort of probably a level up from that, managing like the entire layout of your page, but not necessarily low-level user interface controls.
Awesome. That's awesome. I'm definitely going to have to look into this a little bit more.
In many ways, it's interesting. Dijit is kind of the basis for where the original web component specification came from. So if you look, for example, at a project like Polymer, which is in very pre-alpha, it is in essence building Dijit over again on top of the web component spec and the Shadow DOM API and a lot of these, new APIs that are sort of based on the things that we've done with Dijit that really should be easier to do in a browser. So you can imagine Dijit 2 or Dijit 3 eventually moving in the same direction, building on top of, whatever's available in a browser. But we're pretty pragmatic in Dojo, so we really take what's there today or what's there very soon. And whereas a project like Polymer is sort of, here's where the world is going to be in 5 years. Let's start building for it now because Chrome supports it.
Does somebody use a different browser?
Yeah. Remember, Dojo has a lot of enterprise users, and a lot of them don't have choice, and so they're stuck with IE 8 or 9. Or, a lot of people still do like Firefox because,
They're purists.
I actually prefer Firefox for one reason, and that's the awesome bar. The awesome bar remembers more about what I've done conveniently than Chrome's address bar does. And so I find myself using Firefox for most of my non-development work, which is like, reading articles. I know, like, if I can remember a fraction of the title from like 6 months ago and I haven't cleared my history, Firefox will remember it for me. Whereas Chrome, I kind of have to remember sort of the order in which the title was described. It doesn't really do a good job of remembering sub-words that I've, browsed in my history.
I have noticed with Chrome that it is a little bit inconsistent about how it remembers your history.
Yeah. And that alone is enough for me to still use Firefox. And, Firefox has improved a lot in terms of performance. And so, that said, choice is good. We're all about choice. We want to support any browser that isn't terrible. So, for example, Dojo 2 will support IE 9 and newer and, other modern browsers, but it won't support 6, 7, and 8. Whereas Dojo 1 still supports 6, 7, and 8. And it's still going to be maintained for a while until no one cares about those browsers anymore.
How do you make a decision like that?
Well, it's actually one we made recently, and it's not an easy decision because we do have a lot of enterprise customers who are using IE 8 and 7, and that one of the reasons they choose Dojo is because we do support those browsers pretty well. But they do contribute to this factor of, wow, there's a lot of code in there that is kind of old and kludgy to support those browsers that we'd love to get rid of. And really we're looking at, okay, Microsoft is going to finally, hopefully for real, end of life IE 8 and XP next year. So if Dojo 2 comes out next year at roughly the same time, we can safely assume that, all right, we can support browsers that are actively supported by their vendors today. And we still have the 1.x, line of code that we're going to continue to support as long as people care, so that we can still give them updates and crucial fixes. But that way we can focus most of our new efforts on something that's a lot cleaner.
So I'm just curious, because I heard that with jQuery, when they made this decision, it allowed them to remove a ton of code from their code base. How much code do you think that's going to remove from the Dojo code base? In
some modules, 10 or 20%, and other modules, 100%. We have some code that is strictly for 6, 7, and 8 support. Overall, I don't know a total percentage, but it really, like, for example, our native vector graphics implementation, GFX, it supports Canvas and SVG, of course, but it also supports Silverlight and VML. So the Silverlight and VML code can be dropped immediately. There's probably half the code base for vector graphics. And we'll add in WebGL support, presumably, and be able to support more features. So like there's one module where it's a huge benefit. Querying, to be honest, if you drop 6, 7, and 8, there's not really much left to do for querying. IE 9 doesn't quite have all the features you might want. And of course, there are custom, selectors that aren't really part of any CSS3 spec that maybe you want to support. But you can probably shave 80 to 90% off the size of your query engine if you don't have to support 6, 7, or 8. Other features like, aspect-oriented programming, you really don't save anything at all, except maybe, the ability to do native getters and setters, in modern browsers gets rid of some of the, cruftiness you might need in your API. Though there's still some work to be done in ECMAScript 6 before we really can drop some cruft there as well. The ability to basically watch for a change to a variable is something that's kind of elusive and always supposedly like one, release away. And we're never quite there to have a clean solution. So we basically have to re-implement, the ability to bind or watch changes to properties or variables throughout, an entire code base, which means sort of your entire API is built around that notion, and that adds a lot of cruft, and we would love to get rid of that, at some point in the future as well.
So you mentioned Dojo 2. You mentioned part of it is dropping support for old browsers, but what's cool there that's coming besides that?
Well, that's still early. We're still a year out, and we're kind of deciding what is cool and what is not. To me, one of the things that's kind of bugged me for a couple of years is we have Dijit and we have Dojo Mobile. And Dojo Mobile is a collection of, user interface optimizations for mobile UIs, right? And it's not quite the same as Dijit. And now you can use Dijit on mobile, or you can use Dojo Mobile on mobile if you want to, sort of match the look and feel of the device. And so one of the things we'll do for Dojo 2 is basically say, all right, we've got one user interface library, and maybe the term's kind of silly, but we want responsive digits, right? So basically, if you've got a widget and you change to a smaller form factor, you want to be able to change the capabilities of it quite easily. And that's not really something you can do with responsive design with widgets, because responsive design is basically about media queries and pulling in CSS. But, if you rely only on that, you're going to pull in all the JavaScript logic that you need for both the desktop and, mobile browsers. And that's not necessarily ideal because, of course, in the environment of a phone, you want to optimize for, your resources being as tiny as possible. So then you see people sort of, optimizing in ways that are not fun and not pleasant. So we really want to sort of streamline that process. Really just making it easier to build applications. We've seen a lot of maturity, from, you mentioned Ember and Backbone, and Dojo's had a lot of app frameworky stuff, but I think we'll see something come along that'll be quite powerful and quite easy to use that really hasn't been done before. Just there's so many different ways to go, from like local storage to, really nice grid widgets to cleaner APIs. And it's not really as sexy as saying like, look, here's this brand new thing that's reinvented the wheel from scratch. But you just see lots of different things that can be cleaned up and made possible that weren't really doable when we started Dojo, in 2004, or when 1.0 came out in 2007, right? So if you think about it, 1.0 is a version of Dojo, and we're on 1.9 right now, which was just released earlier this month. And you can pretty much write code in 1.0 that will work in 1.9. And so basically we've, through the course of Safari and Chrome being introduced to the world and being turned into real browsers, and, the iPhone coming out and all of the mobile browsers that have followed since then, we've managed to create a toolkit that you can pretty much take old code and make it work with the new version. That said, of course, if you want to take advantage of newer features like AMD, you do have to rewrite a lot of your work. But still, it's pretty impressive to think that something that was created, 6 years ago can still work today. And in fact, like Apple was using Dojo 0.4 on their store until I think it was last year. So they were using code that was 7 or 8 years old to, basically update your shopping cart with the pricing information based on the features you had selected for a very long time. So, we're really into longevity of code, which is cool. But so 2.x is sort of the time where we say, okay, a lot's changed in 6 years. It's time to provide a better starting point that's easier to work with, that takes advantage of browsers today and tomorrow without alienating our users, of course. So, giving migration scripts and a path forward, and not changing the APIs so much that people feel like it's a completely new toolkit. They might as well reevaluate the world, but, something that keeps what they like but improves upon it rather than just burning it down and starting over.
It seems like it's not the dominant tool, even though it's been around for so long. And I guess the question I have is, how do you market an open source project? Or how do you help people figure out that Dojo is the tool that they need?
So it's interesting. It's not a problem I worry about. And maybe that's a bit naive, but, I worry about building good tools that people can use in a nice open source ecosystem. So to me, if one tool wins, we've kind of failed in our mission, right? The goal isn't to make Dojo win at the expense of jQuery. The goal is to provide stuff that people want to use. And if they don't want to use it, they'll use something else. And no amount of marketing is really going to change that. Now, that said, probably the best thing we did to market Dojo ever was create a collection of tutorials on the Dojo site that make Dojo more approachable to a wider audience of people.
I'm going to interject here because they are really good. I've been reading through them, and they're excellent. They're superb.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, basically SitePen spent about a year of development time, for a person, but, spread across the team to create most of those because we felt like people complained relentlessly about the documentation. Now they complain that there's too much documentation. So I'm okay with that complaint. What it means is we've got too many different versions of too many different things because we version our documentation by release, and it's easy to end up on the wrong version and all those good problems. But good documentation and good APIs are the best way you can market an open source project, followed quickly by nice demos that impress people and do that. But Dojo is used extensively throughout large enterprises. So, the number of banks, insurance companies, large corporations, pharmaceutical companies, companies that you're not going to find out because they're not blogging about it, but then you find out they've got 3,000 developers that use Dojo for, 100 web apps internally. That's not sexy, but it's awesome. And so what we find is we've got 1% of the public internet and 25 to 50% of the private internet, use Dojo. So it's not the sexy thing that's going to, make people say, wow, Amazon.com used this. They're set in their projects, but, we have a lot of users and obviously enough to support the project and support companies built on top of it and use it. So, my focus is if Dojo is not a project that I would use as my first choice, then I've lost my way, and that's where I start. And so 2.0 is sort of about making sure that continues. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much we market old stuff. No one will use it in 2 or 3 years.
So I did want to throw out there, for people in the Midwest, KSL used to use Dojo.
Awesome.
Oh, cool.
The other thing I was going to say was, if you look at YUI, I noticed you posted a link there, right? YUI 3 made a huge mistake, and that was they basically remarketed themselves as all the cool features in jQuery and Dojo, but as YUI. But then when they released, one of the reasons people really liked YUI 2 was it also had a number of nice user interface widgets, done differently than Dojo, but you could say it was somewhat comparable to Dojo's widget set. And they released with 4 UI widgets. And so everyone said, but where are the widgets? That's what I like. That's what I use. So when when we released Dojo 2, we can't just release the core and say, yeah, we'll have another set of widgets in a year. No one's going to care until the UI components and, convenient features are there. And so we won't be making that mistake, hopefully.
Sounds kind of like how no one will care about the Wii U until Mario Kart is there.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, though, Wii U really has not done super well. And yeah, I think that's really it, all the stuff that people want to do with it, they can't yet.
Yeah, right.
So the reason I posted the link to the YUI, because I just wanted to bring up this idea of graded support, and it looks like they changed their page because with YUI 2 or 3 or whichever one it was they released, they had this graded support where basically they'd say
ABC.
With certain browsers it would gracefully degrade, so you wouldn't be getting the shadows or something like that. And I was just kind of wondering if you guys have a particular feeling about graded support versus just dropping it entirely, and when is the right time? Because you touched on it a little bit, but I just wanted to hear a little bit more.
Well, so Dojo today supports IE6, but there are features you simply can't get in that browser, so we degrade reasonably well there. But for something like Dojo 2, we're really saying, this isn't going to work in IE 6, 7, or 8. And it's kind of a fundamental, there are features that you simply don't get in that browser that we need to build a toolkit for tomorrow. Otherwise, you will basically run into a bunch of new toolkits that don't worry about those browsers that can do all these amazing things that you simply can't do. And that's kind of the point at which you say, look, we can't continue to support this anymore, is when it's just inhibiting your ability to get anything done. So for example, supporting all of the ugly CSS issues with 6, 7, and 8, right, are just not fun. And, if you look at this underlying structure of some of the widgets, you're like, what is this mess, right? And it's because it's the only way to get that particular widget to work in 6 or 7, right? And we don't want to do that anymore. And pretty much 9 and newer, at least we, have a better baseline starting point. And, if you look at jQuery, they've basically said, the biggest disappointment is we still have to support old Android. So they still have a whole bunch of, hacks for old Android browsers in their code base.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, jQuery 2.0 dropped support for the old Internet Explorer, and for some functionality they have it's like jQuery.backwardscompat or something like that.
Yeah, it sort of warns you of the features that you need to add. I mean, they're doing kind of an interesting thing, which is like you can use jQuery 1.10 or jQuery 2.1, and they match feature-wise. But I don't think we'll go that route because I don't think it's necessarily worth the effort. I think people that are kind of on the 1.x code line aren't going to want to make the jump until they're ready. And so what we'll do instead is just continue to maintain them differently, and basically, if you have to support older browsers, you use the older APIs. If you're ready to drop 6, 7, and 8, you use the newer work. And it really fundamentally comes down to a few things, in JavaScript and CSS that you simply can't shim easily without introducing a lot of cruft throughout your API. And we're ready to move on.
So I noticed that I feel like jQuery dropping support for Internet Explorer, old crappy browser, and using strict mode is really kind of paving and brightening the way for other toolkits and frameworks. Do you feel like your decision to finally move forward with Dojo, was it all influenced by that broad opening?
It made it easy to convince people that doubted it was the right time, because you have people who say, oh, we can't drop IE8, everyone uses it. And then the same people will say, everyone uses jQuery. And so we can say, you're not really making a lot of sense here. So it's certainly a data point that helps us, believe that it is the right time. But we did notice there is some backlash against their approach. People don't read long enough to see, I can continue to use 1.10 and it will still work. So, basically you have to inform users and make it easy for them to understand the differences, and why they would do that. But I do think waiting another year for us is a good thing, because it sort of coincides with that end of life for enterprises.
And the enterprise customers, yeah.
And because we have so many enterprise users, it makes sense for our group.
Well, and I really like the model of maintaining the old version and moving ahead with the new version, at least for a certain period of time, because then people can start preparing to make the transition.
Yeah, I mean, we have users who are just now upgrading from 1.0. So they've been using that since 2007. And they're just now saying, this 1.7 or 1.8 looks nice. And, it's like, where have you been the past 6 years? Because it's honestly quite easier to sort of upgrade each release a little bit at a time, rather than to say, I haven't touched this code base in 6 years, I'm ready to change it. But, enterprises work differently than most of us who prefer the, public-facing web. So that's our world.
So are you guys going to follow suit and start using strict mode as well, or are you guys still holding off on that?
The reason we haven't used strict mode to date is because we have this module called dojo.declare. And what it does is it allows you to sort of basically define superclasses, define mix-ins that are going to be combined into a class, and then call up the inheritance chain using this.inherited call. And that breaks strict mode. So we have some ways around that we figure we'll implement for 2.0. But to be honest, strict mode isn't the most exciting thing to us. When we do run tests and compare the performance gains by stripping out features, that you wouldn't use with strict mode, it doesn't save us a lot more than just using the normal closure compiler. Maybe it shaves a couple more % off the size of our code base. So it's not as big of a gain as we expected, so it hasn't been as high of a priority for us, though I know why people like it, of course. But basically the normal closure compiler gives us 90% of the gains we normally get, and strict mode just adds a little bit more on top. So it hasn't been as high of a priority.
Okay. And then a lot of the other frameworks are starting to support Node, so that it can use the DOM library that's in Node. Are you guys doing any testing with that, or are you just focusing on browsers?
Dojo has worked inside of Node for a couple of releases now. In 1.8, it was a little strange because basically you would pull in Dojo, and then to pull in Node, you would actually reference it through an AMD plugin back to Node. whereas 1.9 introduces sort of a more natural approach for working with Node inside of Dojo. But, the biggest complaint people have is sort of like, well, I'm used to CommonJS. Why do I want to use this AMD thing? And, there's a lot of debate around should we move to UMD, which to me is okay, yet another hack on top of modules, which is like another line of this really terse boilerplate that you insert inside of every file. And, do you want to impose that on every single module that's created, or do you want to use a build step to add that for people?
And personally, for that, I just wish that Node would add the define syntax native.
Right.
I don't see where one is actually a clear win over the other. I mean, I think CommonJS and RequireJS really can do the same work. Exactly.
And actually, there was like a 1 month stretch where it was inside of Node and then it was removed. This was back in like 0.4 or 0.2 or, sometime pretty early in the project. So like, for example, Dojo provides a module that just adds that right into Node, and then you can use, the require and define syntax that you're used to with AMD, which we like a lot, of course. But, so yeah, I mean, you can run Node, Dojo inside of Node as you would, and things work pretty nicely. Like, for example, we refactored our XHR module, and it's now called Dojo Request in 1.8. And basically, when you require Dojo Request, if you require it in a browser, you get XHR by default. If you require it inside of Node, you get just a normal HTTP request object. So, there's a lot of clever things inside of Dojo that work well that way, that weren't there before.
So, can I ask a little bit more about the Dojo Foundation? That seemed really interesting to me, and I've heard of it,
Sure.
but I wasn't super informed about it. So how do projects get in there? Is it only things that spin out internally from Dojo, or do you adopt external things, kind of like Apache does sometime? Or
so when we started the Dojo Foundation, we looked at Apache and we saw a lot of process, and we said we don't really want to like become an incubated project. And so we talked to like the Python Software Foundation and the Eclipse Software Foundation, and they said, it's not that hard to set up a foundation, and really it wasn't. But we wanted one that was incredibly focused on code, like t-shirts and servers, and keeping people out of legal trouble and nothing else. So it's a very minimalistic foundation. So like we have a board, but we never meet. We occasionally send emails. The process for approving projects is basically someone writes up a proposal, sends it to me, I give them feedback on it. It gets sent out to the list of all committers across all projects. Everyone votes +1 or -1. And after 2 days, it's either in, or they're told to go back and refine their proposal if it got so many no votes. And then from there, a project pretty much just has to basically say, I'm going to run this project in what Dion Almayer coined as a 100-point open source project, which means that basically you run the project in the open, the decisions are made in the open, one single vendor doesn't control the project, you abide by a license such as the BSD license or Apache license or MIT license, and that you do your work in the open, and that's pretty much it. And so, we have a collection of projects like RequireJS and the Dojo Toolkit and the Jetty Comet D implementation for server-side, real-time WebSockets and stuff. And then we have projects like Lodash, which was done by John, David Dalton. That's basically a rewrite of underscore. Or we have animation projects.
Can I just say real quick?
Go ahead.
I love his terrible attitude. He is hilarious. Like, I just love how anytime there's an issue on underscore, he fixes it in Lodash first and then like posts back in the issue request and just crazy stuff like that. He's a total jerk, but he's so freaking awesome about it.
Yeah, he kind of walks this fine line between complete asshole and completely funny, and it kind of depends where you're sitting on that particular day, whether you find it funny or asshole-ish. But he's very focused and passionate about what he believes and pushes it forward. And he alone has pushed underscore in a way that most projects don't get that benefit from their critics. Most critics will just go and do something else, but he's basically said, yeah, I'm going to do it better, but I'm also going to help make you better. And, that's pretty cool and pretty rare. And we released a few weeks ago a new project called The Intern, which is a new testing tool that we can talk about in a bit. But he basically posted some very arcane, pull requests that, frankly, no one is ever going to run into these problems. But he's right, they are bugs. But it's sort of like if you're dealing with 50,000 things, it's probably not the 3 things you would care to touch first. But, he cares enough about certain things that he'll do that. And that's pretty cool. And yet can be frustrating at the same time, because you're like, I want to focus on adding this shiny new thing, not making sure that, IE6 testing works properly with the intern, that sort of thing. So yeah, good stuff. So Dojo Foundation is basically projects that have been voted in that manner. And beyond that, once you're a project, you're kind of on your own. We'll offer support and help, and if community issues come up, but you're kind of just left to your own devices. So there's really not a lot of governance other than giving people feedback when they ask questions and stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sounds cool.
So going back to the toolkit for a minute, is it pretty easy to test if I put it into my stuff?
Yeah, so Dojo itself includes a testing framework called DO, which is a completely contrived acronym for the sound Homer Simpson makes when things fail. DO! That sort of thing. And in fact, there is actually an optional module where you can turn on and off sounds, do and woohoo, which is cute. But at the same time, this tool was not actively maintained in a meaningful way for several years, and many new testing tools have come out. So one of the first things we said for Dojo 2 was, hey, okay, great, we've got these 15 or 20,000 tests or maybe more inside of all of Dojo, but we need a better tool that supports things like continuous integration and different styles for writing assertions and code coverage analysis and, being able to test against the cloud and hooking into Travis CI. So we wrote a new project called The Intern, which uses Dojo for some basic features, but works with any JavaScript tool. What's cool is basically each test suite is just an AMD module. And so you write these AMD modules that define your tests, your startup methods. You can write unit tests, or you can write functional tests using the WebDriver wire protocol and all those good things. And then you can run your tests in the browser. You can run them in command line against, Node, or you can run them against Sauce Labs or any Selenium grid in the cloud. And then, it just has a bunch of nice pluggable things. So if you don't like our assertion syntax, we chose to use the one from our project called Chai. You can write a little adapter to, plug in the syntax that you like. Or if you don't like the code coverage analysis tool and you find something else you like, just plug that out and plug something new in. Or if you don't want to test against Sauce Labs, but you want to test against some other service that's come out, you just, unplug that part of the module and plug something in its place. So it's really cool and really handy, and it's definitely what we're replacing Do with. But so that we have a tool today and we have a tool for tomorrow that's usable with Dojo 1.8 as well as anything going forward, as well as people have written tests examples using Backbone and using jQuery and using other projects, and we've been getting random pull requests and patches from really cool people. Like the founder of Lifehacker, she submitted a patch one weekend that was for a typo in the documentation. But it's just cool to see people that, you have no idea that they care, and suddenly they're submitting pull requests on the weekend, and it's pretty neat.
Nice. So the other question I have for you is regarding you talked about vector graphics a little bit ago, and usually there are two things that I see vector graphics used for. One is for cool looking animation, some kind of game or just something cool to look at. And the other thing I've seen it used for is charting a graphic. So right. What support do you have for awesome art, and what support do you have for charting a graphic?
Charting and graphing is the easier one. We've had DojoX charting since 2005 or 6, and it's a rich charting API. It supports financial graphs. It supports, area. It supports your standard 20 or 30 plot types. It supports themes. It supports multiple axes, multiple plots layered on top of each other. But the coolest feature is that it's backed by the same object store API. So you can basically say, hey, I've got this object store that provides all my data. I'm binding it to my chart, to my form, and to my grid. And I make a change in the form, and it updates the value in the chart, updates the values in my grid. And so you have sort of this convenient way to synchronize different views of the same data concisely. And then there's the project that SitePen's been working on called Voro, which is voro.com. And it is basically a hosted cloud version of financial charting built on top of Dojo's charting API for basically customers that don't want to bother to figure out how to do charts, but they're looking to move from, Flex or Silverlight charts to web-based charts. And it's kind of the last thing holding financial institutions back completely from moving away from proprietary technology is a solid, robust charting implementation. And so we've been working on that as well. And then lower level, we have Vector Graphics API, and it's called GFX for graphics, and it supports 2D and 3D effects, animations, visualizations, and it follows roughly the SVG semantics for shapes and lines and curves and drawing. And you can draw like bubbles, or you can draw their classic tiger example and other animations. And this is probably an area where we're not as good at marketing as D3 or processing or the other one that I'm forgetting that's also popular.
Raphael?
And then yes, Raphael there, thank you. And so there's a lot of projects out there. We've been doing this quite a bit longer, and we do have a wider feature set in terms of like supporting more rendering engines than any of the other projects out there. But it's competitive with those, and it's been around forever. And the rewrite for 2.x will be to basically strip out some of those libraries that we don't need anymore, or technologies we don't need anymore, like VML, and add in WebGL. So basically, it'd be nice to be able to say, look, I've got one API to write vector graphics, whether it's Canvas, SVG, or WebGL.
Nice.
That sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Then on top of that, there are implementations like gauges and other, visualizations that people use in dashboards. So like IBM Portal ships with Dojo. So anything you can imagine sticking into a portlet, they've wanted to be able to do with Dojo. Or there's a DojoX drawing API that lives on top of it that creates sort of like a Visio-style diagramming tool inside of the browser on top of GFX. So there's really a lot of different ways that people have taken it, and some of it's a little crufty, and some of it's really awesome, but it's all there to hack on and use if you want.
Awesome. All right, well, I think we're just about out of time. We haven't heard a whole lot from Joe. Joe, do you have any questions?
You guys keep asking my questions before I get a chance. No. I'm good.
So we asked all 8 of Joe's questions, too.
I did kind of want to talk a little bit about the history of Dojo and this whole thing with adding things to the prototype. I think that's a really interesting conversation and history, especially for people that aren't familiar with that.
Sure. So Dojo and Prototype.js were kind of, became popular at the same time, and Prototype extended native objects, and we refused to do that. And so it kind of informed the decisions that were made. And when jQuery came out, they kind of followed our way. When MooTools came out, they kind of followed the Prototype way. But everyone has pretty much moved away from extending the native prototypes because you just don't know how your projects are going to be used. You don't know how people are going to do it, how they're going to mix with other things, and it's just, even though it can create a cleaner API, it's just not generally safe. And so, but at the same time, in some cases it can create really nice, clean, elegant API structures, but you always run into a problem with them that you don't expect.
Yeah, there's a really cool feature in the C# language where you can extend a class's interface, but only within a given scope.
Right.
And that's something that would be fantastic in JavaScript. But it was just very interesting the directions that the different tools took, and which tools back when well, I think this is all on BBS's back 9 years ago, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Awesome.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get into the picks then. AJ, you want to start us off?
First off, I have to say that I am a feminist, which is not much like a feminist. So my personal belief is that the differences between men and women should be celebrated, and that women should be treated with respect and dignity, but not that they should be treated not like men, not that they should be expected to be like men or behave like men or perform like men. And it really, really bugs me when it's women putting down other women for doing so-called traditional roles. Well, traditional roles like, homemaking, taking care of kids, being a nurturer. So this week I ran across 2 things that were just kind of interesting for me to think about. One was actually really gratifying. It was this woman has a blog article about Grand Theft Auto and how she's incredibly outraged that you can rape prostitutes in the game. That's a feature of the game. And I completely agree. And I wonder, where are all the other women that should be, supporting that and making an outcry against, that kind of thing being published by a company. And then another one was I watched My Fair Lady, which is this old Audrey Hepburn 1964 movie. And it was just kind of eye-opening to look at just the way that it was kind of a progressive movie, I would imagine. I mean, I didn't live in the 60s, but it seemed like it was kind of poking at the issue of equality and just the way that the characters are portrayed, and it just kind of made me think. I wouldn't say that I necessarily liked it in the end. I don't feel like there was enough progression, there wasn't enough character growth. But
well, My Fair Lady is based on Pygmalion, which was a famous play from like 50 or 60 years before that, and it was exactly about like inequality and not just like gender, but also just sort of class inequality that was really common in England at the time, and like sort of, you know, sniffing and like, you know, sort of looking down at the caste system that was in place. In many ways, there was like that Eddie Murphy movie, Trading Places, that you could sort of think of as like the modern day reinterpretation of that in an alternate way, where like, you know, Eddie Murphy is like swapped with a broker, and he's like a bum, you know, and they swap him, and these two brokers have a bet that they can sort of like, you know, basically turn Eddie Murphy into this successful stockbroker, and, you know, that it doesn't really take much at all. And, you know, they bet $1 on his life, basically, you know, that they could do that. So, it's kind of one of those recurring themes and I posted a comment in the chat that was like, you know, this is kind of like the debate between like double equals and triple equals, right? So like, equality doesn't mean identity. And that's sort of my belief on your sort of original point. You know, it's like, we're not all equal, but we should be equally respectful and appreciative of people and their choices they want to make. And, you know, that's what a free society is really about, is choice and, you know, respect.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think
that's my attempt to take it from a scary area to like back to not getting email complaints about the topic.
That double versus triple equals thing, that was deep, man. I'm still thinking about that. That was great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But it was very well put, you know. Yeah, and, you know, depending on what you believe, you know, different lifestyles fit well or don't fit well. So, you know, you be respectful of what other people believe and think and want to do. And,
if people would just worry more about themselves than what everyone else is doing, they'd be a lot happier. And, you know, I mean,
as long as they don't think that semicolons are optional.
Right, because that would just be ridiculous.
Agreed.
Yes. Just break your build all the time.
I can't count on someone else to take care of that for me?
No.
All right. Jameson, what are your picks?
I have two. They're less controversial. Well,
Thank you.
less political. Let's put it that way. One is an amazing movie called Moon. It came out in 2009. I just saw it recently, and it's great. It's a hard sci-fi movie that asks some interesting questions related to what we talked about identity and equality. And it was done on a really low budget, so it's not like huge special effects, like crazy action, but there's lots of things in it that made me think. So it was great. One of the best movies I've seen in a long time. The other one is a band called Dr. Dog. I heard about them from somebody on Twitter. They're like if the Beatles and Johnny Cash were alive today, kind of like old country pop style, but a little more modern. Not that like, I don't know, plastic pop country that's on the radio right now, but it's great stuff. So those are my picks.
Awesome. Joe, what are your picks?
Apologies if anyone likes plastic pop country. That's not a real apology.
That's one of those, I'm sorry you didn't like that.
I'm sorry you're offended that I told you your music was awful.
All right. Joe, what are your picks?
All right. So this week's been an awesome week for iPad gaming. There's 2 games dropping this week for the iPad that are just going to be sweet. Warhammer Quest, which is out already, and that's a remake of a board game, and apparently they did a really good job adapting it for the iPad. And then the other one is Knights of the Old Republic 1 is coming out on the iPad, which everybody should be rejoicing, clapping, possibly crying as they hear this news that it's coming out on the iPad.
Yeah, I just muted a girlish squeal. So
Good to hear. Yes. And so I'm going to pick those two games. On top of that, I'm going to pick the book Ruins, which is the second novel in a series by Orson Scott Card, whose fantastic novel Ender's Game is coming out in movie form later on this year. Very excited for that. And so it's the Pathfinder series. Book 2 is out. It's a great book, great novel. It's very similar in spirit to Ender's Game or Harry Potter, younger protagonist, but a very interesting mix of sci-fi and fantasy. Really a great novel. And then the other thing, I picked this last week, I'm not really picking it so much as just making a note. My Pluralsight course on Angular fundamentals is number 2 out of 500 courses on Pluralsight, which I think speaks a lot more about the popularity of Angular than about necessarily anything about me, because I don't think people are watching it just because it was me, because nobody knows me, except for you guys, and not very well. We never get together. What's wrong with us?
yeah, we should get together.
Yeah. And so, anyway, I just think it's really interesting that it's been like the number 2 most popular course on Pluralsight for quite a while. Out of 500 different courses, it's been the second most popular course, which I think is very cool and speaks a lot about Angular. So that's my picks.
Awesome. All right, I'll go ahead and go next with my picks. My first pick is an iPhone app that I've been using for the last week or so, and I really, really like it. Of course, I say that whenever I talk about an iPhone app. This one's called Commit, and basically what it is it's a way of tracking whether or not you did something that day. Anyway, basically the idea is you put in what you want to have done each day. So the things in mine are work out every day, take my morning medication every day, not drink caffeine every day, and take my evening medication every day. And so then you kind of get in the habit of doing it. And the thing that's awesome about it is you check it off each day. And so like on Take Morning Meds, it's 7 days in a row that I've been doing it. Not drinking caffeine, I had 3 days in a row. And then last night I forgot I was trying to not drink caffeine and I had some Diet Pepsi. But anyway, so it kind of gets you some momentum, and then you just don't want to break the streak. And
so you're kind of gamifying your life.
Yeah, a little bit, but this is the only thing that's worked so far for some of this stuff.
That's
so.
nice. That's cool.
Yeah, so anyway, my feeling is that, these things, since they're important, if I can make them a priority and gamify it like that, it's really awesome. So as long as it keeps working, I'll keep using the app. And I really did hate breaking that streak yesterday, so I think it's going to work just fine. And I'm kind of adding new things to it every few days, because there are a few other things that I have as goals to do every day that I don't do unless I have it in here. So anyway, it's awesome. And I learned about it from a book called Authority, which is also by the same guy that made it. And Authority is his book on marketing ebooks. And if you have any product really that's any kind of digital product, Authority is a great book. It's by Nathan Barry, and you can find all his stuff at nathanbarry.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Dylan, what are your picks?
I had a pile of them. Let's see. So, of course, the Intern was the testing tool I was talking about that you should check out. There's, because we talked so much about AMD and you guys are talking about games, there's a module called Frozen.js that if you're interested in building 2D web games, you should check out. In college, I was a hammer thrower, and the world record holder is Yuri Sadiq, and you have to watch this video of him throwing. It's just the most ridiculous, cool thing ever. He throws it like, I don't remember how many meters, but it's like almost 300 feet was the world record holder. And this is from like 1980s. He's Russian. He's on a lot of steroids. It's really cool. Yeah. But one of the things that you'd mentioned in the email was basically saying, what are some of the things you do that makes your life easier? I do a lot of Kundalini yoga and meditation, and I learned that from my now wife. But basically, it's a type of yoga that is sort of not just about like how bendy you are or how well you can stretch, but it sort of combines like mind, body, breathing, and it kind of gives you like a life hack for anything. So like if you're feeling tired, they say like there's a Kriya for that, or if you're like feeling sore, there's a way to get around that, or if you're feeling depressed, which isn't something I really have a problem with, but if you are, there's like a Kriya for that. So it's like this guy who invented like these thousands of yoga sets and taught them around the U.S., like, from like 1970 till about 2006 when he passed away. And it's just really powerful stuff. And it's also the first kind of meditation I've ever done where I'm actually able to do it, because a lot of it is like chanting driven meditation rather than like sitting there with your mind blank for 20 minutes, which just puts me to sleep. Arcosani is this cool place in Arizona. We got married there. It was also the place we had our first date. And what's cool about it is it's this place that's an arcology that was built by this architect who was Italian. And he wanted to basically come up with a community that could be self-sustaining and sort of like, very environmentally friendly. This has got these really cool architectural settings. And what was really fascinating is he passed away like the week we got married. So it was just a really powerful experience for us. And then we went on our honeymoon in Bali and with a layover on the way back in Seoul. And, Seoul is a very underrated place. It's got a really cool art district called Insadong, and it's well worth a couple days spending there. And then Bali is like Hawaii meets Thailand, and it's just a really cool, awesome place to spend a few weeks and get away from it all and disconnect, and yet still be connected enough that you can get really nice food and spend time on the beach or go hiking in the mountains or go water rafting or snorkeling or scuba diving or all those good things. So that's those are my picks for the past month or week or whatever.
Awesome. Those are awesome picks.
Yeah,
I think I'd like they would make my life better. I think you accomplished that goal.
Awesome. Thanks. And of course, Dojo would help with that too if you so see fit.
Yeah, right. Good. Okay. And other than that, we'll wrap this show up. We'll catch y'all next week.